In 2018, a seemingly perfect family was shattered in one of the most horrific and inexplicable crimes in recent history. The story of Chris Watts, who murdered his pregnant wife Shanann and their two young daughters, Bella and Celeste, shook the nation. It was a crime that raised questions about what happens behind closed doors and how a man who appeared to be a loving husband and father could carry out such a heinous act. The case captivated the media, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but also due to the layers of deceit and manipulation that Chris Watts spun in the aftermath. This story is not just about murder, but about betrayal, cold calculation, and the darkness that lurked behind the facade of a happy family. Chris Watts and Shanann Catherine Zuchek seemed like the quintessential American couple. They lived in a beautiful home in Frederick, Colorado, and had two adorable daughters, Bella, 4, and Celeste, 3. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with their third child, a boy they had already named Nico. On social media, their life looked idyllic. Photos and videos of family vacations, loving captions, and heartwarming moments with their children painted a picture of happiness and fulfillment. Shanann, who worked as a marketing representative for a nutrition and wellness company, frequently posted updates on Facebook. She often praised her husband for being a doting father and a supportive partner. Their life together appeared perfect. But behind the curated photos and smiling faces, things were not as they seemed. Chris worked as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum, a large oil and gas company. He was quiet, reserved, and seemingly unremarkable to those who knew him. He wasn't the type to command attention, but he was known as a good husband and father. Yet, in the summer of 2018, cracks began to show in the Watts marriage. Shanann had noticed changes in Chris. He had grown distant and withdrawn, seemingly uninterested in her and their children. This was a stark contrast to the man she had fallen in love with. She tried to confront him about it, but Chris always brushed off her concerns. Meanwhile, Chris was harboring a dark secret, one that would ultimately destroy his family. In June 2018, Chris began an affair with a co-worker, Nicole Kessinger. They met at Anadarko, where Nicole worked in environmental health and safety. Their relationship quickly became intense, and Chris fell deeply for Nicole, leading him to fantasize about a new life with her, one without Shanann and the responsibilities of fatherhood. While Shanann was away on a business trip, Chris and Nicole spent more time together, growing closer by the day. Chris began to lie to Shanann about his whereabouts and activities, hiding his relationship with Nicole. As their affair deepened, Chris became more emotionally detached from his wife and children. Shanann, who was pregnant and already feeling vulnerable, sensed that something was terribly wrong. In early August, she went to visit family in North Carolina with their daughters, hoping that some distance would help clear her mind and perhaps give Chris time to reflect on their marriage. But during the trip, Shanann's suspicions grew even stronger. Chris was cold and distant, barely responding to her messages or phone calls. When he did speak to her, he seemed disinterested and evasive. Desperate for answers, Shanann confided in her friends about her fears that Chris might be having an affair. She even texted him, asking bluntly if he was seeing someone else. Chris denied it, but his behavior only fueled her growing anxiety. Shanann returned home from her trip on August 13, 2018. She was determined to confront Chris about their marriage and find out the truth. That same night, Shanann's friend Nicole Atkinson dropped her off at home after a business trip to Arizona. It was the last time anyone outside the family would see her alive. Early the next morning, when Nicole couldn't reach Shanann and noticed that she wasn't responding to texts or calls, she grew concerned. Shanann was always communicative, especially since she was pregnant, and it wasn't like her to go off the radar. Nicole drove to the Watts house and noticed that Shanann's car was still in the driveway, but there was no sign of her or the girls. Worried, she contacted the police. When the police arrived, they conducted a welfare check. Chris was at work but returned home to meet them. He appeared calm, if not slightly nervous. He told the officers that he had no idea where his wife and daughters were. He suggested that maybe Shanann had taken the girls somewhere, but her car, purse, and phone were all still in the house. As the hours passed, the situation grew more alarming. Shanann's family and friends began to fear the worst. Shanann was not someone who would leave without letting anyone know, and the fact that she was pregnant only heightened their concern. Chris continued to maintain that he had no idea what had happened. He gave a television interview, pleading for the safe return of his wife and daughters, but his performance was unconvincing. He seemed emotionless, detached, and too rehearsed. To those watching, something about his demeanor didn't feel right. As the investigation progressed, police became increasingly suspicious of Chris. His behavior was strange, and his story didn't quite add up. Investigators asked him to take a polygraph test, which he agreed to, seemingly confident that he could pass. However, the test results indicated deception, and Chris failed the polygraph. Confronted with this, Chris began to crack under the pressure. Finally, during a lengthy interrogation, Chris confessed to his father that he had killed Shanann, but the story he told was far from the truth. He claimed that after a heated argument, Shanann had strangled their two daughters in a fit of rage. In response, Chris said he had killed Shanann in retaliation. It was a desperate attempt to shift blame onto his wife, even in death. But investigators weren't buying his story. They knew that the evidence they had collected told a different narrative. Chris's phone records showed that he had been texting Nicole Kessinger the night before Shanann's disappearance, and he had made several suspicious moves in the days leading up to the murders, including the disposal of crucial evidence. Faced with mounting pressure and the weight of his lies collapsing around him, Chris finally told investigators the truth. A truth so dark and horrifying that it shocked the entire nation. In the early hours of August 13, 2018, after Shanann had returned home, Chris and Shanann had an argument. Shanann was trying to discuss their marriage, but Chris had already made up his mind. He wanted to be with Nicole and saw his family as an obstacle to his new life. At some point during the argument, Chris strangled Shanann to death. Their daughters, Bella and Celeste, were asleep in their beds at the time, completely unaware of what was happening to their mother. After killing Shanann, Chris knew he needed to dispose of the bodies. He wrapped Shanann's lifeless body in a sheet and placed her in the back of his truck. Then, in an act of unspeakable cruelty, he loaded his two young daughters into the truck as well. The girls were confused, but didn't fully understand what was happening. Chris drove to a remote oil field where he worked. There, he carried out the final, most heinous act of his crime. One by one, he smothered his daughters to death. Bella, the older of the two, reportedly fought back and begged her father not to kill her. She asked him, "Daddy, no," but Chris was determined to end their lives. After murdering his children, Chris buried Shannon's body in a shallow grave near the oil tanks. He then disposed of Bella and Celeste's bodies by placing them inside the oil tanks. It was a horrific and calculated effort to hide their bodies and cover up his crime. Once Chris confessed, investigators recovered the bodies of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste from the oil field. The details of the murders were almost too horrific to comprehend, and the community of Frederick, Colorado, was left reeling from the tragedy. Chris Watts, the man who had once been seen as a loving father and husband, was now known as a cold-blooded murderer who had annihilated his entire family for selfish reasons. The motive for the crime was clear. Chris wanted to start a new life with Nicole Kessinger, and in his twisted mind the only way to do that was to eliminate his family. His desire for freedom and his affair with Nickel had driven him to commit the ultimate betrayal. Nickel, who had no knowledge of the murders at the time, cooperated fully with the investigation. She was horrified to learn the truth about Chris and immediately cut off all contact with him. She expressed deep remorse for her involvement, although she maintained that she had no idea what Chris was planning. On November 6, 2018, Chris pleaded guilty to the murders of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and his unborn son, Nico. By pleading guilty, he avoided the death penalty, which Shanann's family had agreed to in exchange for him taking full responsibility for the crime. On November 19, 2018, Chris Watts was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, 3 to be served consecutively and 2 concurrently. He also received an additional 48 years for the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy, and 36 years for tampering with the bodies of his family. The Watts family murders left an indelible mark on those who followed the case. It was a stark reminder that the perfect life portrayed on social media is often an illusion. Chris and Shanann's seemingly happy marriage was a facade, hiding a deeply troubled relationship that ended in the most tragic way possible. Shanann's family, the Razucheks, were devastated by the loss of their daughter and grandchildren. In the aftermath, they worked to raise awareness about the dangers of domestic violence and the importance of recognizing the signs of a potentially abusive relationship. They wanted Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico to be remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. The case also sparked a national conversation about family annihilation, a term used to describe cases where a parent kills their spouse and children. Experts analyze the psychology behind such acts, trying to understand what drives someone to commit such unimaginable violence against the people they are supposed to love and protect. In Chris's case, his desire for a new life, combined with his affair and financial stress, may have contributed to his decision to murder his family. One of the most striking aspects of the Watts case was the role that social media played in shaping public perception. Shanann was an active user of Facebook, regularly sharing updates about her life, her family, and her marriage. Her posts portrayed a picture of happiness and love, which made the brutal murders even more shocking. How could a man who appeared to be so devoted to his wife and children commit such a heinous crime? Shanann's social media presence became a focal point in the aftermath of the murders. Some people scrutinized her posts, suggesting that the pressure to maintain a perfect image may have contributed to the tensions in her marriage. Others pointed out that social media can often mask the reality of a person's life, creating a false sense of security for those looking from the outside. For many, the Watts case served as a chilling reminder that the images people project online don't always reflect the truth. Behind the smiling photos and loving posts, there can be deep, hidden pain and conflict. The story of Chris Watts is one of the most disturbing and senseless crimes in recent memory. It's a tale of betrayal, deceit, and the darkest depths of human nature. Chris Watts, a man who seemed to have it all, a loving wife, beautiful children, and a stable career, threw it all away in a calculated and cold-blooded act of murder. His desire for freedom and a new life led him to commit the ultimate act of betrayal against the people who loved him most. This case continues to haunt those who followed it, not just because of the brutality of the murders, but because it raises so many questions about human nature, family dynamics, and the masks people wear. How could a man who appeared to be a devoted father and husband turn into a monster overnight? How could he look his daughters in the eye and still carry out such a horrific act? In the end, Chris Watts will spend the rest of his life behind bars, paying for the unspeakable crimes he committed. But for the families of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico, the pain and loss will never fade. Their lives were stolen in an act of unimaginable cruelty, and the memory of their tragic deaths will continue to haunt all who knew them. As soon as the details of the Watts murders came to light, the media exploded with coverage. News outlets, both national and local, seized upon the story, captivated by the shocking betrayal of a father murdering his wife and children. The Watts case quickly became the latest true crime sensation, drawing comparisons to other infamous family murders like the Menendez brothers and Scott Peterson. What made the Watts case particularly unique was the intense media scrutiny it attracted from both traditional news sources and social media users. For months, coverage of the case saturated the airwaves and internet. The public was not only horrified by the brutal nature of the crimes, but they were also fascinated by the way Chris Watts had presented himself in the aftermath. Calm, collected, and disturbingly detached. Chris's interview with the local news station just after his family was reported missing became infamous for how emotionless he appeared. Standing outside his home, he pleaded for their safe return, but his performance was wooden, as though he was going through the motions rather than genuinely grieving. The contrast between his stoic demeanor and the violent actions he had taken only a day earlier was chilling. This interview became a key turning point in public perception. Body language experts, psychologists, and armchair detectives dissected every word and gesture, pointing out inconsistencies and peculiarities in Chris's behavior. For many, it was obvious from the start that Chris wasn't just an innocent husband desperate to find his missing family. He was hiding something much darker. Social media played a significant role in shaping the narrative around the case. Within hours of Shanann and her daughters being reported missing, people across the world were following the case online, watching Chris's interview and scrutinizing his behavior. Discussion forums, YouTube channels, and true crime podcasts began picking apart every detail of the investigation. Some users went so far as to dig through Shanann's social media posts, looking for clues that something was wrong in the Watts marriage. In particular, Shanann's Facebook page became a focal point. Her frequent posts about her children, her marriage, and her career were seen as a window into her life. But, as with many social media portrayals, the picture Shanann painted wasn't the full reality. Many speculated that the pressure of maintaining this image of perfection might have contributed to the breakdown of her marriage, while others defended her, insisting that Shanann had been completely blindsided by Chris's actions. This intense media attention created a spectacle around the case, which only heightened the tragedy. The Watts family murders were no longer just a local crime. They had become a global obsession, drawing in people who were eager to understand how such an atrocity could have happened. But with that attention came another problem: victim blaming. While many people sympathized with Shanann and her children, there was a disturbing undercurrent of blame directed at her. On various online platforms, some people suggested that Shanann's personality, her social media presence, or her alleged controlling nature may have driven Chris to commit the murders. Others questioned her parenting style, or her decision to work while raising two young children. These cruel speculations were not only insensitive, but also deeply misguided. Shanann had been a victim of an unimaginable crime, yet, in the eyes of some, she was being unfairly scrutinized for her role in the breakdown of her marriage. The harsh reality is that Shanann was a loving mother, a dedicated wife, and a hard-working professional who had no reason to suspect that her husband would turn into a monster. The blame lay squarely on Chris Watts, the man who had made a conscious decision to destroy his family. This victim blaming extended even further to Chris's daughters, Bella and Celeste. Some online commenters speculated that perhaps Chris felt overwhelmed by the financial and emotional responsibility of raising two young children, with a third on the way. They framed his actions as a desperate response to feeling trapped in a life he no longer wanted. But the truth is much simpler and more horrifying. Chris Watts didn't kill his family because he was stressed or overwhelmed. He killed them because he wanted to start over. He wanted to leave behind the responsibilities of fatherhood and marriage to pursue a new life with his mistress, free of any ties to his past. It was an act of selfishness, pure and simple, driven by his own desires rather than any external pressure. In the aftermath of the case, Shanann's family spoke out against the victim blaming, reminding the public that no one deserved what happened to her and her children. They worked to preserve Shanann's legacy as a devoted mother and wife, focusing on the love she had for her family rather than the circumstances of her death. For them, it was important that Shanann be remembered for how she lived, not just for how she died. In the years since his conviction, Chris Watts has become one of the most notorious family annihilators in modern history. He was sent to Dodge Correctional Institution, a maximum security prison in Wisconsin, where he will spend the rest of his life. Due to the nature of his crimes, Chris is kept in protective custody, isolated from other inmates who might target him because of the notoriety of his case. While Chris's life in prison is bleak, with little contact with the outside world, he has given a few interviews to investigators and journalists since his incarceration. In these interviews, he has offered more details about the murders, admitting that his original confession was a lie. He acknowledged that he had planned the murders in advance, and that Shanann had never harmed their children, as he had initially claimed. Chris's prison interviews revealed a chilling lack of remorse. While he expressed some regret for what he had done, his statements were often self-centered, focusing on how his actions had affected his life rather than the lives of the people he killed. He has described moments of feeling guilt and remorse, but these admissions are often overshadowed by his cold, detached demeanor. Despite being behind bars, Chris continues to receive letters from people fascinated by his case. Some letters come from individuals who claim to be in love with him, while others come from true crime enthusiasts who want to understand his motives. This bizarre attention only underscores the ongoing public fascination with the Watts case, even years after the murders. For the families of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico, Chris's continued existence is a painful reminder of the loss they have endured. They have worked to move forward with their lives, but the shadow of the murders looms large. Every time Chris's name is mentioned in the media or in a new true crime documentary, the wounds are reopened, and they are forced to relive the horror of that August day in 2018. The Watts family murders left a lasting impact not only on those who knew the victims, but also on the broader public. For many, the case served as a stark reminder of the unpredictability of human behavior. Chris Watts had no criminal history, no history of violence, and no outward signs that he was capable of committing such a brutal crime. He was, by all accounts, an ordinary man. Yet he became a cold-blooded killer, driven by a desire to start a new life. The case also sparked important conversations about domestic violence, mental health, and the pressures of modern life. Experts pointed out that while Chris Watts's actions were extreme, they were part of a broader pattern of family annihilations, crimes in which a parent, usually a father, kills their spouse and children in an effort to escape their responsibilities. These crimes are rare, but when they occur, they are often motivated by a combination of personal and financial stress, as well as a desire to control or escape a situation that the perpetrator views as inescapable. The Watts case also highlighted the dark side of social media. In the wake of the murders, many people reflected on the ways in which platforms like Facebook and Instagram can create unrealistic expectations and pressures. Shanann's carefully curated social media presence painted a picture of a perfect life, but behind the scenes, her marriage was crumbling. For many, the case was a reminder that the images people share online are often far removed from reality, and that the pressures to maintain a facade of perfection can have devastating consequences. For the families of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico, their legacy is one of love and resilience. Shanann's family has worked tirelessly to keep her memory alive, sharing stories of her kindness, her determination, and her love for her children. They have also become advocates for victims of domestic violence, using their platform to raise awareness and help others who may be in abusive or dangerous relationships. The Watts family murders were a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. They left behind a void that can never be filled, but they also serve as a cautionary tale about the hidden dangers that can lurk behind closed doors, and the darkness that can reside in the hearts of those we think we know best.